Hey guys, tonight we're starting with something strange. You're lying there, soft under your blanket, maybe scrolling through videos in a half day. And somewhere, deep inside that nice modern brain of yours is a flicker, a quiet little spark that belongs on a battlefield. Because while you may think of yourself as peaceful, the species you belong to, well, it's got a bit of a temper. Picture this. A newborn baby barely blinking, its fingers curling like tiny question marks. Now smash cut to a mushroom cloud. Flames, shockwave, destruction. That's humanity. Somewhere between lullababis and launch codes, something went wrong. Or maybe terrifyingly, something went exactly as planned. Is violence part of our DNA? Or did we learn it, perfect it, sharpen it into something beautiful and terrible? Because if you zoom out far enough, history doesn't look like progress. It looks like a pattern. Build, burn, rebuild, repeat. And you, snug as you are right now, are a direct descendant of those who did the burning. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, let me know your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin life in warmth and silence. But out there in the long, grim parade of history, things are anything but quiet. Violence isn't just in the headlines. It's in your posture, your reflexes, your deep responses to fear. It's in the curve of your fingernails and the spike of your adrenaline when someone yells in the street. It's older than language, older than memory, and perhaps more terrifyingly, it's natural. You don't start off violent. You start off squishy, blinking, and confused. But within weeks, you'll grab, cry, and even hit. Not because you're evil, because that's how you get attention, protection, food. It's strategy, not malice, but the wiring is there. Even infants show signs of territoriality, of reacting with distress when other babies enter their space, which is both adorable and vaguely alarming. Some evolutionary psychologists believe that the capacity for aggression is just as baked in as the need for affection. Your brain is a tightrope walker, balanced between empathy and fear, compassion and defense. And over thousands of years, those who struck first often survived longer, which makes your gentle brain, ironically, a war-tested organ. Consider this. The same neural pathways involved in solving puzzles are involved in strategic violence. Your capacity for cooperation, for building, negotiating, planning is the exact same machinery used to lay ambushes, coordinate attacks, and engineer cruelty. It's not that we evolved despite violence. We may have evolved because of it. But here's the weird twist. Even in the midst of all this, you still crave peace, warmth, storytelling. You make music, raise children, cry at movies. So, how do those two things coexist? How can the same species develop both the nuclear bomb and the violin? Historians still argue whether early humans were more violent than we are now, or whether we've just gotten better at hiding it. Some point to the drastic decline in homicide rates over the last few centuries. Others warned that mass violence, genocide, war, systemic cruelty has only grown more efficient. It's like asking whether a single punch is worse than a drone strike. The metrics are tricky, but what's not tricky is this. You've inherited everything. The screaming, the hugging, the building, the burning, all of it. And it's in you whether you notice it or not. That flicker when someone cuts you in line. The jolt when a door slams. The rush when you're winning an argument. Small echoes of ancient struggles. Micro-duels played out in your modern life. Even your fiction loves a fight. Your favorite shows, your favorite games. They're saturated in tension, in battle, in glorious stylized destruction. There's something deeply satisfying about the struggle, the risk, the triumph. It doesn't make you cruel. It makes you human. Still, the question haunts you. Are you evolving past violence or just pausing between rounds? Let's zoom way, way back. Long before cities, before metal, before kings and queens and Wi-Fi and toothpaste, there were just people barefoot, hungry, sunburnt. They hunted, scavenged, slept in the open. And when they saw someone from a different band of humans, they didn't always trade recipes. Sometimes they fought over food, over water, over fear of the unknown. That's where we're heading next, because the evidence, bones, broken skulls, scattered spears, tells a story most bedtime books skip. But don't worry, you're not that kind of human tonight. You've got a pillow, a quiet room, and the luxury of listening to history instead of making it. You're standing in the middle of a dry, open plain. There are no roads, no buildings, no signs of civilization, just wind, dirt, and bones. You crouch down and brush away some dust. A fragment of skull stares back at you, cracked clean through, as if someone once drove a sharp edge into it deliberately. Not by accident, not by animal, but by design. This is not some post-apocalyptic horror scene. This is the past, and it's far more brutal than you imagined. The first weapons weren't used for cooking or crafting. They were used to kill. The oldest stone tools ever discovered, dating back over 2.5 million years, weren't polished or elegant. They were crude, angular, designed to bash, to tear, to break bone. Yes, they were used to butcher animals, but every so often, one of those bones belonged to something that walked on two legs. You probably picture early humans as scruffy, cooperative hunter-gatherers sharing food and stories around a fire. And sure, sometimes they were, but those fires cast long shadows. And sometimes in those shadows, someone was sharpening a rock. The fossil record tells a bloody tale. Take the site of Nataruk in modern-day Kenya. About 10,000 years ago, a group of foragers, men, women, even children, were attacked and killed by another band of humans. Their skeletons were found with fractured skulls, broken ribs, and obsidian blades still embedded in their bones. Some were bound. None were buried. It wasn't a skirmish. It was a massacre, and it's not an isolated case. All across prehistoric sites, archaeologists have unearthed signs of intentional violence. Parry fractures on forearms, crushed craniums, projectile wounds. These weren't accidents. These were deliberate acts. Historians still argue whether this kind of violence was common or exceptional. Was it widespread tribal warfare? Or were these occasional flare-ups in an otherwise peaceful time? Some researchers think early humans lived relatively harmoniously with violence reserved for extreme situations. Others believe that territorial disputes and resource competition made conflict nearly inevitable. But either way, one thing's clear. Violence didn't start with civilization. It started before pottery, before language, before anyone wrote anything down. It may even be older than us. In fact, there's a chilling possibility that violence played a role in shaping what we became. Picture this. Two small groups of early humans encounter each other by a river. One group is stronger, more coordinated, more aggressive. The other is outnumbered, unprepared, slower to react. Who survives? Whose children go on to pass on their genes? Who learns to strike first? It's a grim kind of natural selection. And the ones who made it weren't always the nicest. Here's a quirky little detail. Some of the earliest tools weren't just weapons. They were brain enhancers. Well, not directly, but learning to make and wield tools encouraged brain development, cooperation, and planning. So, ironically, the very act of inventing ways to hurt others may have made us smarter. Violence then wasn't just destruction. It was innovation. Even hunting animals involved violence on a scale that seems shocking today. Imagine driving a herd of giant prehistoric buffalo off a cliff. Not one or two, hundreds. Bones shatter, bodies pile up. The sheer scale of it is staggering. It wasn't personal, but it was bloody. And then, of course, there's cannibalism. Yes, some of the earliest human remains show signs of being butchered like animals. Cut marks on bones, missing marrow, skulls split open. Historians still argue whether it was ritualistic, nutritional, or just desperation. Maybe all three. But whatever the reason, the result was the same. Violence taken to its logical extreme. But here's the weird part. Even in the middle of all this, humans were also learning to care, to bandage wounds, to bury their dead. Some ancient skeletons show signs of surviving injuries that should have been fatal. Broken legs that healed, skull fractures that closed, which means someone helped, someone brought food, someone waited. You're already seeing the contradiction, aren't you? The same people who sharpened spears were also developing empathy. The killers were also the caretakers. The bloodletting and the nurturing were never separate paths. They were parallel ones, and it gets more complicated. You walk through a site filled with tools, shaped stones, bones, burnt wood, and then you spot something strange. Red ochre, a pigment. Maybe used for body paint, maybe for ritual, maybe even for art. Imagine that. Hands still stained with blood, reaching for color. Violence and beauty side by side in the dirt. So, what does it mean for you? It means your ancestors weren't just brutal. They were brilliant, resourceful, capable of both horror and tenderness, and somehow you inherited it all. Now, it might be tempting to think we've moved past those days, that we've become civilized. But don't get too cozy just yet, because those stone tools eventually turned into swords, then guns, then bombs. And each time, the question wasn't whether we could make them, it was whether we should. And usually the answer was yes. So next time you look at a smooth stone on the ground, remember it's not just a rock. It's the ancestor of every weapon ever made. And in the story of human history, it was the first quiet whisper of violence to come. You're walking now barefoot, skin browned by the sun, the sky stretching wide and hot above you. There's no border, no fence, no signpost to tell you where your land ends and another's begins. But you feel it instinctively. This is your place, your waterhole, your fruit trees. And that group of strangers on the hill, they don't belong here. Long before maps, humans understood territory. You didn't need flags. You needed only need and fear and maybe the smell of unfamiliar sweat drifting on the wind. Early human groups, small, mobile and bound by blood, moved through landscapes like ghost herds, but they weren't alone. Other groups followed the same trails, hunted the same prey, claimed the same shelters, and sometimes they met. Sometimes they negotiated, sometimes they attacked. Prehistoric violence wasn't organized in the way modern war is. There were no generals, no uniforms, just sharpened sticks, desperate eyes, and the question them or us. And here's the strange thing. You weren't always the aggressor. Sometimes you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. A misread gesture, a stolen kill, a sleeping child making too much noise near someone else's cave. Suddenly, you're running or fighting or both. Archaeologists have found skeletons dating back tens of thousands of years, showing repeated healed injuries, broken arms, fractured ribs, dented skulls. These weren't one-time accidents. These were battle scars. Historians still debate how much of this violence was organized versus opportunistic. Were these surprise raids, feuds that escalated, or the early versions of planned targeted attacks? Some evidence points to seasonal conflict, groups returning to the same places each year and clashing over hunting grounds or mating rights. Others suggest that vengeance may have played a role. One group steals, the other retaliates. Sound familiar? It's not so different from the patterns you see today. Only the weapons have changed. But let's get practical. Food was scarce, water scarcer. You couldn't just DoorDash a bison burger. Every calorie cost effort. So when another group encroached on your territory, they weren't just intruders. They were threats to your survival. The decision to fight wasn't emotional. It was logical. And then there's the darker truth. Sometimes violence was useful. You raid a neighboring group. You kill the men. You take the women and children. Now your numbers grow. Your labor pool increases. You pass on more of your genes. It's horrific. And from a cold evolutionary lens, it worked. Even language may have evolved partly because of violence. You needed to plan, to warn, to coordinate a hunt or an ambush. Complex communication gave you an edge. So, your ancestors who could whisper strategies had an advantage over those who only grunted. Here's a quirky thought. Some anthropologists suggest that the sound of human speech evolved to carry better across open savas, meaning our very tone, our cadence was shaped not just by song or storytelling, but by survival coordination, tactical whispers beneath moonlight, maybe even a pre-battle chant, and don't forget intimidation. Before the first blow is struck, there's the dance, the display of power, screaming, drumming, painted faces, waving weapons. Some conflicts ended before they began because one side looked scarier. In fact, the rise of symbolic behavior, body paint, masks, aggressive postures may have been a way to avoid fighting altogether. Bluffing worked, and the best bluffers, they didn't die. But even with all this pining and threatening, people still fought a lot. And often the victims weren't warriors. They were bystanders, children, elders. Violence in prehistoric life wasn't always fair. It was rarely noble. It was messy, primal, and frighteningly efficient. Let's talk about one case. Gebel Sahaba, Sudan, about 13,000 years ago, a mass burial site. Dozens of individuals, many with arrowheads still lodged in their bones. Some bodies show multiple wounds, suggesting they didn't die immediately. They suffered, they lingered. Some had healed from earlier injuries only to be killed later. Violence wasn't rare for these people. It was routine, and that's the haunting part. You might imagine ancient violence as rare, desperate, even accidental, but the patterns suggest something else, something more systemic, tribal, ritualized, ingrained. And yet even here you find tenderness, bodies buried carefully, arranged with care. Graves marked with ochre, shells, beads. Grief existed. So did memory, love, mourning. These people weren't savages. They were you, without Wi-Fi. They laughed, sang, held hands, and sometimes they killed. Modern humans like to draw a neat line between then and now. But there's no line, just a long fading smear. The instincts that led you to protect your property, defend your group, distrust outsiders, they haven't disappeared. They've just learned to wear suits, to post online, to shout at city council meetings instead of throwing rocks. You still have the old wiring. You just run modern software. And while you lie there, cocooned in your blankets, your ancestors whisper. In dreams, in reflexes, in the way your heart races when footsteps follow you too closely at night. This isn't ancient history. It's your inheritance. The grass beneath your feet changes. It gets thicker, wilder. The landscape feels familiar, but something's off. You hear distant shrieks, a rustle in the trees. Then you see them. Faces like yours, but not quite. Longer arms, heavy brows, smaller chins, and something cold in their eyes. You're not in Homo sapiens territory anymore. You've crossed into someone else's home. Welcome to the world of your cousins, the primates. You might imagine humans invented violence, that it's the unfortunate price of civilization. But the truth is, long before the first humans struck each other, your evolutionary relatives were already getting a head start. Take chimpanzees. Cute, sometimes deadly. Often in the wild, they don't just fight, they wage war. Raiding parties of male chimps sneak into neighboring territories, ambush solitary males, and attack with brutal coordination. They target the face, the genitals, the throat, and when they're done, they retreat in silence, leaving only silence and blood behind. It's not just random aggression. It's strategic. Chimpanzees expand territory through conquest. The fewer rivals, the more food. The more food, the more mates. Sound familiar? And it's not limited to chimps. Gorillas can be violent too, especially when silverbacks fight for control of a group. Their brawls are thunderous, chest-pounding contests of strength and will. Mating rights often hang in the balance. Sometimes infants are killed during takeovers. A brutal reset, nature's cold reboot. But there's a twist. Bonobos, close relatives of chimps, rarely resort to violence. They use touch, play, and affection to diffuse tension. They've evolved a different strategy. Love, not war. Historians, primatologists still argue why these two species turned out so differently. Environment, diet, social structure. The debate continues, but the comparison is striking. Even among apes, violence is a choice, a tendency, not a law. Which brings us to your more immediate family, the hominins. You walk into a shallow cave. Bones crunch underfoot. In the firelight, you see them. Neanderthals, stockier than you, built for cold and brute force. For a long time, we painted them as mindless brutes. But the more we study, the more we realize they were sophisticated. They buried their dead, made tools, wore jewelry, and possibly like us, fought. Some Neanderthal remains show clear signs of interpersonal violence, cracked skulls, defensive injuries. One famous skeleton had a depression fracture on the side of the head, likely from a club or rock. Not an accident, a fight. And then there's the unsettling evidence of cannibalism. At sites in France and Spain, archaeologists have found Neanderthal bones bearing cut marks, skinned, defleased, split for marrow, just like animal remains. Historians still argue whether it was a ritual, a last resort, or something else entirely. But one thing's clear. The line between survival and savagery was very, very thin. And Homo sapiens, not much better. At some point, the two species met. And though there might have been some peaceful coexistence, and yes, even interbreeding, it's likely that there were also clashes, resource competition, territory disputes, maybe even extermination. Imagine it. Two intelligent species, both armed with tools, both fearing the other. One disappears, one survives. We tell ourselves, we won. But the cost might have been higher than we realize. Here's a quirky footnote. In some Neanderthal sites, right beside butchered bones and ash piles, we find musical instruments, flutes made from bone. It's almost poetic, a cave filled with the echoes of both violence and melody, like humanity itself. So, what does this mean for you, lying there peacefully tonight? It means the roots of violence run deeper than human history. They're tangled in your genes, wrapped around the oldest parts of your brain. The amygdala, responsible for fear and aggression, didn't form in a boardroom. It evolved in the underbrush when being startled meant surviving. But again, duality emerges. You're not just built to attack. You're built to recognize faces, to mimic emotions, to soothe. Empathy and aggression share real estate in your nervous system. A constant push and pull. And that's the real story of violence. It's not about monsters. It's about mirrors. The creatures you descend from made choices. Some clawed, some hugged, some did both in the same breath. And so do you. Now, don't worry. You're not going to wake up tomorrow and join a chimp war party. But it's worth remembering that the next time someone cuts you off in traffic or posts something infuriating online, the surge of anger you feel isn't new. It's ancient. It's rehearsed. It's part of a very old script. But so is forgiveness. So is restraint. You've inherited the weapons, but also the wisdom. And the question remains, which parts will you sharpen? You're walking through tall grass again. But this time you're not alone. Up ahead you hear grunts, the creak of leather, the hiss of flint on stone. A group of upright figures is gathered around a fire, muscles thick beneath furs, eyes dark and watchful. You crouch behind a boulder and realize they're not Neanderthals. They're you or close enough. Homo sapiens, but not the latte-loving kind. The kind that sees another human as either a friend or a threat. And right now, you're looking very much like the latter. Once Homo sapiens began to dominate the landscape, the scale of violence shifted. Gone were the isolated cave skirmishes and messy ambushes. Now it was coordinated, tactical, organized. Welcome to the dawn of what you might call actual war. For thousands of years, hunter-gatherer groups maintained a delicate balance. Small, mobile, hard to pin down. But eventually, people settled. Agriculture began. Grains were stored. Land became valuable, resources hoardable. And suddenly you had something worth defending and stealing. That changes everything. Fighting wasn't just about survival anymore. It became political, economic, even symbolic. If you could control the land, you controlled the food. If you controlled the food, you controlled everything. Mass graves from this period, Neolithic and early Bronze Age, tell a chilling story. At Talheim, Germany, archaeologists found the remains of 34 people, men, women, children. Most with crushed skulls, arrow wounds or deep blade cuts. No signs of defensive wounds. Many struck from behind. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. And this wasn't unique. At Schletz, Austria, another site shows similar mass killings. At Aspan, at Herxheim, again and again, we find evidence of systematic slaughter. Not random, not chaotic, choreographed violence. Historians still debate the causes. Were these ethnic cleansings, ritual killings, intertribal revenge? Some argue it was resource-driven, food, territory. Others suspect ideological clashes, even proto-religious motivations. But the outcomes are unmistakable. The dead weren't just killed. They were eliminated. And they were buried, or in some cases left out for a reason. To send a message. Here's the weird part. This rise in structured violence happens around the same time humans start building things: walls, roads, irrigation. With agriculture comes surplus. With surplus comes hierarchy. With hierarchy comes power. And where there's power, well, someone's going to want more of it. We like to think civilization tamed us, but maybe it just gave us better tools. In fact, early city-states had professional warriors, not just hunters who could throw a spear, specialists, trained killers. That's a big evolutionary leap. When your society can afford to feed people who do nothing but fight, you're officially in a different league. And with cities came writing. You start recording laws and wars, the earliest known written texts. Sumerian cuneiform tablets don't just list grain storage and trade records. They also record victories, troop movements, prisoners taken, even the braggy stuff. Our king defeated their king and took 3,000 prisoners. The human version of trash talk, carved in clay. A quirky detail. Some early tablets include not only who won but how the gods felt about it. If your army triumphed, clearly the gods were pleased. If you lost, well, you must have sinned. It's not just about weapons, it's about meaning. This intertwining of religion and war has deep roots. It wasn't just about killing. It was about killing correctly. Sacrifices had rules. Battles were preceded by rituals. Even mercy could be ritualized. Sometimes captives were spared for religious reasons, only to be sacrificed later in more elaborate fashion. And yet, even in this brutal landscape, humans still tried to build peace. Some early laws tried to regulate revenge. Limit it. If someone from Tribe A kills someone from Tribe B, maybe Tribe B doesn't wipe out all of Tribe A. Just takes compensation. An eye for an eye. A tooth for a tooth. Crude, yes, but better than total annihilation. It's the beginning of justice, buried deep in the blood-soaked soil. But let's be honest, laws didn't stop the violence. They just shaped it, turned it from spontaneous rage into something sanctioned, structured, predictable. You might be less likely to kill randomly, but more likely to kill when someone said it was allowed. And weapons. Oh, they got an upgrade too. Stone axes became bronze blades. Spears got longer, bows got stronger. The moment you figured out how to smelt metal was the moment war got shiny. Imagine facing a bronze sword for the first time. You're holding a stick with a rock on the end. He's holding thunder in his hand. You're not just outmatched, you're obsolete. And that's another dark truth. Violence drives innovation. Better weapons mean more victories. More victories mean more resources. More resources mean more time to invent even better weapons. It's a vicious little circle, and it's one of the engines of history. So here you are, Homo sapiens, toolmaker, fire wielder, song singer, and now warmonger. You didn't mean to become this way, but you did. Slowly, layer by layer, fight by fight. And tonight, while you sleep safe and full, remember some of your ancestors died in a ditch. Their skulls shattered by someone who looked exactly like you, and some survived and passed down their stories, their scars, their instincts. And now they live inside you. You're standing ankle-deep in snow, surrounded by silence so complete it hums. The wind bites your cheeks. A frozen stream glints nearby, and lying face down in the ice is a man, or what's left of him. You step closer. His skin is leathery, his limbs curled. Near his body, a copper axe, a flint knife, a quiver of arrows. His cloak is fur-lined, his boots stuffed with grass. You realize he wasn't just someone. He was someone prepared. And yet, he's dead. Very dead. Say hello to the Iceman. Discovered in the Alps in 1991, UTZ's 5,300-year-old remains offered more than just insight into ancient clothing or diet. They offered a mystery, a prehistoric murder mystery, in fact, because UTZ didn't freeze by accident. He was shot in the back with an arrow. And whoever did it didn't just want him dead. They left him to die slowly. You might wonder, what on earth could someone in 3,300 BCE have done to deserve an assassination like that? Historians still argue. Was it a robbery gone wrong? A political grudge? A feud? Evidence shows he had defensive wounds, cuts on his hands and wrists, as if he fought back. He also had head trauma. And the arrow didn't kill him instantly. It lodged near his left shoulder, severing an artery. Someone meant to make a point. But here's the strange part. His killer didn't take his valuables. Not the copper axe, not the tools, which suggests this wasn't theft. It was personal. Even in the early Bronze Age, people weren't just dying in battle. They were dying in cold blood, literally. You might find that shocking until you remember what we've already seen. That early humans were already practiced in violence, that clans fought, that territory mattered, that betrayal wasn't new. But Yutzi is special because his body was preserved perfectly. We can see his final moment. We can reconstruct it in digital models. We can analyze his blood, his last meal, his tattoos. It's intimate. It's eerie. It's one of the oldest unsolved crimes on record. And it reminds you, the more human society developed, the more reasons people had to kill each other. Let's zoom out. As societies grew more complex, so did their grievances. No longer just food or water. Now it was about status, control, honor, land, revenge, even insult. And when language advanced, insults could cut deeper. A slur, a rumor, a challenge, all it took to spark a feud. The line between justice and vengeance blurred. Many early societies created elaborate codes to regulate conflict. Hammurabi's code from ancient Babylon famously lists an eye for an eye, but it also includes fines, exile, ritual purification. Not every crime warranted death, unless, of course, the victim had social status. Your value, it seems, was directly tied to your position. A noble, execution, a servant, maybe just a slap on the wrist. Justice even then had a hierarchy. And speaking of hierarchy, did you know that one of the earliest kings of Mesopotamia claimed to be a shepherd appointed by the gods? Not just to rule, but to smite the enemies of his people. War was divine. Murder was righteous if done under royal authority. A quirky detail from this era. Some kings carried ceremonial maces, not to use, but to display, symbols of strength, a reminder that the lawgiver was also the lawbreaker, if necessary. Back to UTC for a moment. What makes his story so powerful is how personal it feels. He wasn't part of a mass grave. He wasn't a soldier. He was a single man caught in a moment of fatal consequence. And despite being 5 millennia removed, he feels familiar. His possessions, his wounds, his final steps. He ate aran wheat and ibex meat. He had cavities. He wore a belt with a pouch, neatly organized. If you squint hard enough, he could be you, just with better footwear. And yet his fate reminds us that the impulse to settle scores has always been with us. The careful planning, the ambush, the cold, calculated release of an arrow when your back is turned. It's ancient, it's ugly, it's human. Historians still debate whether UTC's killing was an isolated grudge or part of a larger pattern. Some believe it hints at early political violence. Others suggest clan rivalries. There's even a theory that Yutzi was a ritual scapegoat, a sacrifice sent into the mountains. But with no written records, all we have is speculation. Still, his death fits a broader pattern emerging around this time. Interpersonal violence with purpose. Not chaotic, not wild, but intentional. Surgical and often silent. And that might be the most chilling development of all. When humans learned to kill quietly, without fanfare, without ceremony, that's when violence became a tool, not just a reaction. It's easy to imagine ancient violence as noisy. Screaming, stomping, blades clashing. But sometimes it was a soft footstep, a glint of metal, a short breath, and then silence. Tonight, you're safe, warm. No arrows in your shoulder, but somewhere inside you is a brain shaped by 1,000 generations of survival. A body descended from warriors and meras alike, and though you may never see snow-capped peaks or wear grass-stuffed boots, you carry their instincts. Sai's story is ancient, but his death still whispers, a warning, a riddle, a mirror, and you're still trying to solve it. Now, imagine the sun rising over a wide-open valley. There's mist on the fields, a few scattered huts made of thatch and timber, and rows of something new. Meet lines of stalks swaying in the breeze. Wheat, barley, grain. For the first time in history, you're not chasing food. You're planting it, staying in one place, which in human history is the equivalent of saying, "Come at me, neighbors. Welcome to the agricultural revolution." The moment humans stopped moving and started hoarding. With the birth of farming came an entirely new relationship with violence. Before you hunted what you needed, shared with your kin, and wondered when the seasons changed. But now you've got fences, storage, surplus, and with surplus comes jealousy. With jealousy comes resentment. With resentment comes, well, let's just say the next thing you build after a barn is a wall. This is where war begins to organize itself. Food security changed everything. A family's survival no longer depended solely on luck or skill. It depended on property. Suddenly, defending a patch of soil meant defending your future. People stopped thinking in days and started thinking in seasons, in generations. And that's when my land became a phrase worth killing for. Historians still argue whether agriculture caused war or whether war simply changed form. But the evidence suggests a sharp rise in mass conflict during and after the rise of farming societies. Larger communities, greater resource density, bigger targets, a bloodier story. You might think, well, at least with farming, we got stability. Sure, stability and permanent enemies. Neighboring villages now had boundaries, borders. Entire lifetimes lived next to people you didn't trust, didn't like, or couldn't stop blaming for your dying crops. Add in drought, disease, or a failed harvest, and suddenly raiding your neighbor sounds more like survival than crime. A quirky historical footnote. Early farming tools were often indistinguishable from early weapons. A sickle used to cut grain could just as easily cut through a tendon. A digging stick could be sharpened into a spear. The line between farmer and fighter was thin and often non-existent, and so raids became routine. Not full-scale wars at first, just nighttime strikes. Burn a granary, poison a well, steal livestock, maybe take a few hostages. Enough to hurt, but not to wipe them out. You didn't want your enemy dead. You wanted them weakened or desperate enough to surrender. And if you did wipe them out, well, someone else would just move in. The cycle begins again. Let's not forget the spiritual side of all this. Many early farming societies worshipped fertility gods, deities of crops, rain, and sun. But alongside them, gods of war began to appear. Guardians of territory, defenders of the harvest. Some gods required sacrifice not of grain, but of blood. It's no coincidence that the earliest temples often stood right next to the earliest fortifications. You're building walls to keep your neighbors out and altars to keep your gods in. One is made of stone, the other of silence. And even within these new settled societies, violence doesn't vanish, it adapts. You're no longer just fighting outsiders, you're negotiating hierarchy. The stronger you are, the more land you control. The more land you control, the more people depend on you. Suddenly, violence isn't just about survival, it's about status. A village chief becomes a warlord. A warlord becomes a king. And a king doesn't raid because he's hungry. He raids because he can. Think of it like this. Early human groups were like individual sparks. With farming, those sparks grew into controlled fires, villages, towns, cultures, but they were never fireproof. One dry season, one insult, one ambitious leader. That's all it took to turn everything into ash. And then rebuild, rinse, repeat. You lie there now listening to the soft sound of your own breath. Somewhere in your distant ancestry, someone stood on a ridge, watching smoke rise from the neighbor's fields. Maybe they would have won. Maybe they had lost. Either way, they went back to their mud brick home. Ate stolen grain and sharpened a blade by firelight. That person lived so you could lie here. A chilling comfort. But don't let it keep you up, because for all the horror, there was also resilience. Early farmers weren't just fighters. They were innovators. They developed crop rotation, animal domestication, irrigation. And yes, sometimes they traded instead of raided, bartered instead of bludgeoned. The human story isn't a straight line, it zigzags. For every act of violence, there's a counterpoint. Someone healing a wound, building a bridge, sharing a loaf of bread. But tonight, we're tracking the darker line. And it's about to get even darker, because if food could spark war, imagine what happens when someone says, "The gods told me to do it." It's night. The mountain wind howls low and steady, and the fire you've built crackles softly. You're wrapped in a coarse hide cloak, your hands trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from something deeper. Across from you sits a man with wild eyes and ash on his face. He holds a knife, but he isn't carving meat. He's drawing in the dirt, a symbol, repeating it, muttering. You can't understand the words, but you recognize the tension. Something is about to happen, and you don't want to be here when it does, because you're about to witness one of the earliest forms of ritual violence. As societies grew more complex, so did their fears and their ways of managing those fears. Crops failed, a child fell ill, a comet streaked across the sky. Someone had to pay. And if the gods were angry, a humble apology wouldn't do. They wanted something more convincing: human sacrifice. It's a term that sounds almost cartoonishly barbaric, like something confined to pulp fiction or over-the-top movies, but it was very real, very methodical, and for thousands of years, very normal. We have archaeological evidence of sacrificial pits from ancient Mesopotamia. In some, the victims were carefully laid in rows, arms crossed peacefully, as if they were part of a ceremony they understood. Others, not so much. Some show signs of restraint, of blunt force trauma, of death, not by reverence, but by terror. And this wasn't just a Bronze Age quirk. From the bog bodies of Iron Age Europe, preserved in tannic peat with rope marks still on their necks, to the famous Aztec temples where hearts were cut from chests mid-beat. Ritual killing was a central part of spiritual life, not an aberration, an offering. Historians still argue about the function of these killings. Were they meant to appease deities, to solidify political power, to reinforce social order? Likely all three. Violence became not just a tool of war, but a performance. It was theatrical, symbolic, sometimes even beautiful in its own horrifying way. Imagine the scene. Incense rising, drums beating, a figure raised high before the crowd, then silence, then the blade. People cheered. Why? Because they believed it worked. The rains came. The plague ended. The enemies retreated. Blood in their minds was currency, and sometimes only death could purchase survival. And not all sacrifices were equal. Some victims were prisoners of war. Others were criminals. But in many cases they were chosen specifically because they were valuable, healthy, attractive, even beloved. It was a twisted logic. The gods deserved the best. A quirky example: in ancient China, entire retinues of servants were buried alive alongside their ruler to serve him in the afterlife. Not metaphorically, actually. People buried, breathing. The afterlife needed starving, apparently. But sacrifice wasn't always about death. Sometimes it was about suffering, maiming, mutilation. Think of Viking blood eagles. Though modern scholars debate whether they were ever really performed, the idea of flaying someone's back open to send them to Odin tells you a lot about the values of a culture. Still, it's easy to feel smug now, isn't it? To think, well, at least we've outgrown all that. But have we? Consider how modern societies still stage violence. Public executions lasted well into the 19th century, complete with cheering crowds, packed lunches, and vendors selling snacks. In some parts of the world, they still happen. And even when actual executions fade, the urge remains. We still demand symbolic sacrifices, scapegoats, public shame, cancellation. We don't cut out hearts anymore. We cut reputations. But the crowd still gathers. The chant still rises. The thrill of justice still echoes. There's a strange comfort in it, a sense that the group is cleansed. The world is reset. Order is restored. Violence, when justified, becomes therapeutic. Historians still debate whether these rituals brought people together or simply reinforced power structures. Was the spectacle meant to awe the masses, to distract them, or to unite them under a common trembling fear? Probably all of the above, but let's not pretend it was all top-down oppression. People wanted to believe, wanted to see the knife fall. Because if the gods were real and if they were angry, then better someone else than you. And yet sometimes it was you. People offered themselves voluntarily, walked into temples, drank herbal sedatives, climbed steps they would never descend, not because they were suicidal, but because they believed it mattered. There's a terrifying nobility in that, and a bone-deep sadness. You lie there now, warm and distant. But the echo remains in every standing stone, in every sacred altar, in every story where the hero dies so the world can be saved. Sacrifice is still in the bones of your stories, and maybe in the bones of you. The symbols in the dirt, the chants in the night, the hush before the blade, they're all ancient rhythms your species has danced to for millennia. And though your world is quieter now, less drums, fewer blood pits, the melody hasn't stopped. It just plays in a different key. Now the world is bigger. The fires are larger, the walls taller. You're no longer a lone wanderer crouched behind rocks. You're in a city now. Maybe Sumer or Babylon or early Rome. Cobblestones underfoot, crowds in the market, soldiers at the gates. A world of order, of culture, of trade, and beneath it all, the same old blood. Because here's the thing, the more we built, the more we killed. And not in fits of rage or petty tribal squabbles, but with calculation, with strategy, with spreadsheets carved in clay. Empires rose not through farming alone, but through conquest, through organized industrial-scale violence. If you wanted to rule, you needed soldiers. If you wanted safety, you had to take it from someone else. Welcome to history's biggest long-term investment strategy, empires built on bone. Take the Assyrians. By the first millennium BCE, they had perfected the art of controlled brutality. Their kings boasted in inscriptions of how many heads they took, how high they stacked the corpses, how they flayed enemies and hung their skins from city walls. These weren't war crimes. These were marketing materials. It sounds medieval, except it was older than the Middle Ages. Even the famously cultured Romans were no strangers to organized cruelty. The Pax Romana, Rome's golden age of peace, was peace for Rome. For everyone else, it was a coin toss between enslavement and crucifixion. One quirky record tells of a Roman general who, after defeating a rebellious city, forced the entire male population to draw lots. Every 10th man was executed. The term for it, decimation. Now you know where the word comes from. And still we called it civilization. Historians still argue whether empires were inherently violent or whether violence was just the unfortunate cost of building large-scale societies. But when you look at the bones, mass graves outside city walls, arrowheads buried in vertebrae, skulls split with precision, it's hard to ignore the pattern. With empires came organization, and with organization came bureaucracy. Now, violence wasn't just a crime or a spectacle, it was policy. You weren't just killing someone. You were enforcing law, defending borders, collecting tribute, spreading order. Consider the Persians. By all accounts, they were relatively lenient rulers, letting conquered people keep their religions, their customs, their languages. But if you rebelled, swift, crushing retribution, burned cities, executed leaders, roads lined with bodies as a warning to the next province over, a message written in blood, but oh so legible. And if the Persians were carrot and stick, the Greeks were poetry and power. They brought democracy and also siege warfare, slavery, and the destruction of entire city-states. The Athenians, famed lovers of logic and geometry, once voted to kill all the men of Milos and enslave the women and children. Why? Because Melos tried to stay neutral. Neutrality wasn't allowed. You might think violence came from the fringes, from invaders, barbarians, the universalized, but often it came from the very heart of civilization, from the courts, the senates, the palaces. The architects of empire weren't butchers with blood-stained hands. They were scholars, priests, accountants. Violence had become elegant, a quirky footnote from ancient Egypt. Pharaohs often depicted themselves smiting enemies on temple walls. Not in real-time battle, but in eternal still life. You'd see a giant pharaoh exaggerated in size, holding a kneeling enemy by the hair and striking them with a mace. It wasn't just propaganda. It was a declaration. This is the order of things. Forever violence was ritualized, aestheticized, normalized. And yet, these same civilizations produced art, literature, philosophy, the Code of Hammurabi, and the conquest of Elam, the Iliad, and the sack of Troy, the pyramids, and the lash marks on the laborers' backs. You see the contradiction, don't you? The very societies that gave us written law also gave us mass crucifixion. The cultures that built aqueducts also destroyed entire cities. The tension is constant, civilized and savage, dignity and domination, reason and rage. And maybe that's the point. Because humans didn't grow violent when they became uncivilized. They grew better at it when they became organized. We developed infrastructure, not to avoid war, but to fight it more efficiently, to supply it, to glorify it. And as cities grew, the violence moved further from sight. You didn't have to kill with your own hands. You could hire someone, draft someone, write the order, stamp the seal, and never see the blood. Comfortable, isn't it? Tonight you lie in a room built by generations of planners and builders. But behind every blueprint is a battlefield. Behind every scroll, a sword. Your ancestors didn't just survive by farming and trading. They survived by making sure someone else didn't. And the bones beneath ancient roads still tell the story. So, as you settle deeper into your blanket, remember the empires you dream of weren't made with bricks alone. They were cemented with fear, with force, with fire. And the echoes of that fire still warm in your hands. You hear bells in the distance, not the soft kind from a countryside church, but the heavy clang of iron against iron. You're no longer in a sun-drenched empire of marble columns. You're in a darker place now. The fires burn differently. The weapons are heavier. The motivations holier. Because tonight you've wandered into the age of crusades, cannons, and creative torture. The Middle Ages were many things, a time of piety, plagues, parchment, and peasants. But if there's one thing the medieval world excelled at, it was finding ever more colorful ways to combine religion with violence. Faith wasn't just a comfort, it was a battle cry. Let's start with the Crusades. Those epic, blood-soaked journeys sold to the public as spiritual vacations. From 1096 onward, wave after wave of European knights crossed into the Holy Land under the banner of salvation. What began as a call to liberate Jerusalem turned into centuries of occupation, slaughter, looting, and mismanagement. And the people funding it, popes, kings, bishops, God was invoked at every turn. And for some, he was conveniently silent on the ethics of sacking cities and executing entire populations. At the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, Crusaders didn't just win, they massacred nearly every inhabitant, men, women, children, even animals. Reports claimed the blood ran ankle-deep in the streets. Whether that's poetic exaggeration or not, the horror was very real. And it wasn't just the Muslims who bled. Jews were attacked en route to the Crusades. Even fellow Christians, like those in Constantinople, were pillaged by crusaders in the infamous Fourth Crusade. Holiness, it seemed, had flexible geography. Historians still argue whether the Crusades were about faith or power. Was it a genuine spiritual movement or a political opportunity? Maybe both. But there's no question that the Church, supposed guardian of mercy, had become an enthusiastic sponsor of war. And what about torture? Let's pivot to that creative little chapter. Medieval Europe had a peculiar knack for punishment that combined theater with theology. Heretics weren't just imprisoned. They were corrected through fire, racks, Iron Maidens, and more. Quirky fact, the infamous Iron Maiden, that spiked coffin you've probably seen in cartoons, may never have actually been used in the Middle Ages. Most evidence suggests it was a 19th century invention, retroactively painted into medieval torture law. But that doesn't make the real devices any less horrifying. They had chairs lined with spikes, pairs made of iron that could be inserted and twisted. Devices designed not just to kill but to humiliate, to display pain. Why? Because justice back then was as much performance as punishment. Townsfolk would gather for hangings, beheadings, and burnings. Children were brought along, snacks were sold. It was public, communal, and somehow moral. Because if the condemned had sinned, then his pain was holy. His screams were cleansing the town. And don't think this was isolated to Europe. In Asia, dynasties used similarly inventive forms of justice. Lingqi, the infamous Chinese death by 1,000 cuts, was used to punish severe crimes. It wasn't quick or quiet. The executioner was trained to prolong life, cutting just deep enough to hurt, not enough to kill. It wasn't just about death. It was about spectacle, control. Why do this? Because in these societies, violence wasn't random. It was structured, legal, even sacred. It reminded people that power didn't just rule. It could hurt you. And still, these were the same civilizations that built cathedrals, painted masterpieces, wrote poetry, sang hymns. You could kneel in church on Sunday and cheer at a hanging on Monday. That contradiction runs deep. The Middle Ages weren't dark because people were monsters. They were dark because people were people. And they believed deeply that what they were doing was right. Historians still debate whether medieval violence was worse than other eras or just more theatrical. Some argue that modern war is more destructive, more detached. Others say the raw brutality of hand-to-hand killing made medieval violence more intimate. You saw the fear. You smelled the blood. You had to keep going anyway. And if that doesn't haunt you, you weren't paying attention. Even the weapons had flair. The flail, yes, the spiked ball on a chain wasn't just for dramatic effect. It bypassed shields, shattered bones, and sent a very clear message. This is going to be unpleasant. Long swords, maces, crossbows. Each weapon was a carefully crafted tool for turning humans into stories. And every battlefield was a page in the long, loud novel of empire, loyalty, betrayal, and sometimes just bad weather. You lie there now, still and quiet. But your ancestors marched in boots that sank into mud thick with blood. They prayed before battles. They carved blessings into sword hilts. They believed their killing was justified, even holy. That belief, the deep aching need to make violence mean something, never really left. We've just changed the banners. The world map is changing again, stretching, cracking, bleeding at the edges. You're no longer in one kingdom or empire. You're standing on the deck of a wooden ship, sails billowing overhead, salt stinging your lips. Ahead lies a new world. Behind you, a flag. Beneath your feet, muskets and shackles. And inside your head, a quiet voice saying, "This is progress. Welcome to the colonial catastrophe where violence went global and conquest wore perfume. This isn't the chaos of tribal raids or battlefield carnage. This is violence with a ledger, a spreadsheet, a royal signature. Colonialism is what happens when empires get hungry and realize boats can bring home more than just fish. They can bring gold, spices, land, labor, and power, all at once. At first glance, it seems clean. Letters, patent, charters, treaties, neatly inked, respectable. But behind every discovery was a small army. Behind every settlement was a mass grave. The violence was rarely loud. It was slow, administrative, but no less devastating. When the Spanish arrived in the Americas, they didn't just plant flags. They planted disease, domination, and death. Within a century, an estimated 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas had died. Some from smallpox, yes, but many from war, starvation, forced labor, execution, and yet they called it civilization. Historians still argue about the exact numbers, the motives, the morality. Was it genocide? Was it an unintended consequence? Was it a byproduct of ignorance or cold calculation? The debates fill volumes. But what doesn't change is the outcome. Entire cultures erased, continents redrawn, and wealth flowing steadily back to Europe, built on bones and stolen sugar. Let's talk about a quirky euphemism, the term terra nullius, or nobody's land. It was used to justify taking land from people who weren't using it properly, which translated meant they weren't farming it in the European style. Never mind the fact that they'd lived there for millennia. That's the brilliance of colonial violence. It often came wearing silk gloves, a treaty in one hand, a musket in the other. It didn't always scream. Sometimes it whispered in polished legal ease in polished boots. Consider the British Empire. It covered nearly a quarter of the earth at its height. Its agents spoke of order, law, enlightenment. But order came with flogging. Law came with imprisonment. Enlightenment came with famine and gunfire. In India, the British East India Company wasn't just a business. It was a government with private armies, taxation powers, the ability to wage war. And they did. Famously during the Bengal famine of 1770, while millions starved, grain continued to be exported. Profits stayed strong. After all, market logic is immune to suffering. A dark irony. Many colonial officers saw themselves as moral guardians. They built railroads, schools, hospitals, and at the same time they crushed rebellions, banned native languages, and extracted labor through force. Civilization, they believed, was a gift, and violence, the wrapping paper. Even religion came along for the ride. Missionaries followed soldiers, crosses followed cannons. Faith became a partner in conquest, converting souls while nations consumed resources. This is the age of polite atrocity. Maps from the 17th and 18th centuries don't show war zones. They show opportunity, land to explore, rivers to chart, peoples to tame. They rarely mention the villages burned or the treaties broken. You might think, at least they kept records. And yes, they did, with chilling detail. There are invoices for shackles, reports of casualties, ledgers listing names, weights, and prices of human cargo. Colonial violence wasn't just symbolic, it was logistical. And then came the resistance. Everywhere the colonizers went, people fought back. Rebellions in Haiti, India, Algeria, Vietnam. Brave, bloody, often doomed, but not forgotten. Names like Toussaint Louverture and Ronnie of Jai still burn in history's margins. Remind us that the colonized were never passive. They were fierce, and they remembered. But even rebellion came at a cost. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British retaliated with such savagery that entire towns were left empty. After the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, thousands were detained, tortured, disappeared. These weren't battlefield losses. These were policies, and still they wrote poetry. The same empire that crushed uprisings gave us Shakespeare. The same powers that enslaved nations penned philosophy about liberty. And that's the haunting contradiction. Colonizers often believed their own ideals. They thought they were helping, bringing light. You lie there now, far removed from that era, but your world is still shaped by it. Borders, languages, trade routes, even the clothes you wear and the stories you tell. Many come from a history of ships arriving uninvited. Violence doesn't always need a sword. Sometimes it just needs paperwork. Colonialism didn't just redraw the world. It rewired how humans understood power. It wasn't about hand-to-hand combat anymore. It was about strategy, optics, appearances, and above all, control. You don't need to scream when the system does it for you. And now, as you drift, consider this. The legacies of colonial violence aren't gone. They're inherited in debt, in politics, in memory. The ghosts aren't angry. They're tired. But they still whisper in old contracts, in missing names, in songs sung quietly in a language forbidden long ago. Now you're seated in a hall made of polished stone. There's a gavel at the front, a judge in robes and scrolls filled with laws. People speak softly with phrases like due process and civic order. Everything feels civilized, calm, rational. But you look a little closer and realize that the violence hasn't stopped. It's just wearing better clothes. This is the age of civilized savagery. When violence becomes so refined, so embedded in culture, it almost disappears from sight. You've entered the modern nation-state. And here, the blade doesn't swing in public anymore. It files paperwork. It stamps documents. It sits in courtrooms and governments passed off as normal. In the centuries following the height of colonialism, humanity didn't stop fighting. We just found better ways to justify it. Consider the Enlightenment, the great age of reason, of rights, of revolutions. Philosophers spoke of liberty, equality, brotherhood. And yet at the same time, slave ships continued to cross the Atlantic. Entire populations were still being displaced, punished, or worked to death. Sometimes in the name of reason, sometimes in the name of progress. Historians still argue, was the Enlightenment a turning point toward peace, or just a rebranding of conquest? Because while European thinkers discussed natural rights in salons, their governments were building more efficient bureaucracies for managing colonial subjects. The hand that wrote about dignity was also signing off on mass deportations. You want a quirky example? The French Revolution. It gave us liberté, égalité, fraternity, and also the guillotine. Designed to be swift, humane, scientific, and then used to execute over 17,000 people in a few short years, many of them not nobles, many of them barely guilty of anything more than bad timing or the wrong opinion. That's the modern touch, industrialized, ideologically justified mass violence. And it didn't stop there. In the 19th century, as industrialization accelerated, so did the potential for destruction. Rifles replaced muskets. Gatling guns replaced swords. Now you didn't need a strong arm to kill. You just needed a steady finger. The British used Maxim guns during the colonial conquest of Africa. One famous line from a soldier at the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan: It was not a battle, but an execution. That's not a metaphor. The British lost fewer than 50 men. The opposing army lost over 10,000. The technology gap made warfare asymmetric. One side had steel, steam, and science. The other had courage and no chance. Even diplomacy began to rely on the quiet threat of overwhelming force. Gunboat diplomacy. If you won't sign the treaty, maybe you'll change your mind when a cannon is aimed at your shoreline. You didn't need to invade anymore. You could just imply. And yet at home, societies were becoming more peaceful. On the surface, executions were moved indoors. Public punishments faded. Civility increased. Cities grew cleaner, quieter, more ordered. But underneath it all, the pressure built. Because here's the thing. Civilized society often redirects violence rather than removing it. You don't kill your rival anymore. You sue them. You smear them in the papers. You pass laws that subtly erase their influence. It's still a kind of battle, just colder. And in many places, states took over violence entirely. You weren't allowed to seek revenge on your own. The government did it for you, sometimes justly, sometimes not. Consider the Dreyfus affair in France. A Jewish military officer falsely accused of treason, imprisoned, humiliated, all with the full machinery of a legal system backing it. The public divided. Riots erupted. It wasn't just about one man. It was about how easily a modern state could destroy someone with decorum. And then there's lynching in the United States, an act of pure mob violence carried out with the blessing, or at least the blind eye of local authorities. Often public, often photographed, often postcarded. Not medieval, not ancient. Modern. That's civilized savagery. Even today you'll find echoes in redacted documents in sanitized language. Collateral damage, enhanced interrogation, kinetic action. The vocabulary evolves, but the meaning stays the same. Someone somewhere got hurt and someone else signed the form. It's violence at arm's length. Historians still debate whether modern states have reduced violence overall or simply managed it better. Some argue that crime rates are down, that wars are less frequent. Others point to systems of oppression that persist, quiet, normalized, dressed in paperwork and PowerPoints because you don't need chains to enslave someone. Debt works, borders work, systems work. And those systems were designed brick by people who thought they were improving things. And maybe they were. But even good intentions have shadows. So here you are, tucked in thousands of years later, far from the guillotines, the tribunals, the marching boots. But the legacies linger. You trust systems, you sign contracts, you obey rules, and most of the time that's a good thing. But sometimes beneath the surface, something else breathes, something colder, quieter, wearing a tie instead of armor. And maybe, just maybe, that's more dangerous. Because when violence stops looking like violence, it becomes harder to resist. It slips past your defenses. It's not a scream anymore. It's a shrug. And a shrug, history tells us, can be deadly. You're in a lab now. Not a battlefield, not a throne room, not a smoky sacrificial pit. It's clean here, tidy, smelling faintly of ink, chalk, and metal. Beers bubble. Equations line the walls. A scientist hunches over a workbench, frowning with focus. Not at a weapon. Not exactly. At an idea, at possibility, at progress. This is where violence goes to graduate school. Welcome to the age of science and slaughter, where the brightest minds turn their gaze toward the darkest purposes. It begins innocently enough. A new chemical compound, a better engine, a discovery in metallurgy. But before long, someone's asking, could this kill more efficiently? And almost always, the answer is yes. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how people lived, it changed how people died. Now you could manufacture bullets by the thousand, cannons by the dozen, uniforms, swords, railways to move troops, telegraphs to send battle plans. Science didn't march into war with a drum. It took a train. Historians still argue whether the rise of technology made war more inevitable or just more efficient. But one thing is certain, it made war bigger. Take World War I, known as the war to end all wars, though of course, it didn't. Over 16 million people dead. Not from swords or famine, but from artillery, machine guns and chemicals, chlorine gas, mustard gas, invisible, inescapable, agonizing. And who created those weapons? Scientists. many of them respected, patriotic, brilliant, working not out of malice but duty, curiosity, pride. One quirky detail, Fritz Haber, the German chemist who helped develop chemical warfare during World War I, also created a method for synthesizing ammonia from nitrogen, leading to modern fertilizers. He helped feed the world and helped poison it. Same man, that's the paradox. The knife that slices bread can also stab. The same intelligence that cures disease can engineer genocide. And it gets worse. By World War II, we had perfected the art of mechanized violence. Tanks, planes, napalm. And then in August 1945, the world changed forever. You know what's coming. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The atomic bomb was not just an explosion. It was the birth of a new kind of violence, one that could erase a city in seconds, melt shadows into concrete, end tens of thousands of lives before the second hand clicked. And it wasn't done in rage, it was done in calculation. Historians still debate whether the bombs were necessary, whether they ended the war more quickly or simply showcased American power to the world. But whatever the motive, the message was clear. Humanity now had the power to destroy itself completely, and we built that power in the name of peace. You lie there now in the comfort of a world that didn't end in 1945, but could have and still could because nuclear weapons didn't go away. They multiplied. Nation after nation raced to build their own. A strange kind of logic. The more everyone has, the less likely anyone is to use them. Like pointing loaded guns at each other and hoping nobody sneezes. Even our language reflects the coldness of modern violence. Mutually assured destruction. A phrase so tidy, so diplomatic until you picture what it actually means. The scientists behind these developments were not villains. They were curious, driven, often haunted. Some wept at the results of their work, others stood by it. And some, like J. Robert Oppenheimer, famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. That's not just poetry. It's guilt in a lab coat. But it didn't end with bombs. Science turned toward the brain. Psychology became a weapon. Propaganda evolved from pamphlets to cinema. Entire nations learned how to mold public opinion to weaponize fear. The battlefield moved into the mind. MK Ultra, torture programs, behavioral experiments, governments using citizens as test subjects, all in the name of security. And medical science used to classify, segregate, justify eugenics, phrenology, sterilization. In Nazi Germany, doctors played a central role in identifying who should live and who should die. That's the horror of this era. The violence didn't always look like a sword. Sometimes it looked like a graph, a prescription pad, a clipboard. But before we condemn it completely, let's be honest, science also saved lives. Vaccines, surgery, clean water. Lifespans doubled, mortality dropped. We cured more than we killed. And yet, the same brains that gave you penicillin also built cluster bombs. Historians still ask, is it the science that's dangerous or the hands it ends up in? Because knowledge is neutral. Application is not. You're not guilty for this history, but you're not untouched by it either. Your world, the comfort you enjoy right now, is a product of both invention and destruction. The chair you lie in, the screen you're watching, the power in your walls. None of it exists without the legacy of war-born innovation. And as you close your eyes, just know someone somewhere is probably inventing something right now. Something incredible. Something that might save lives or end them. Progress and peril as inseparable as fire and smoke. And your species always dancing at the edge. You're back in the city again. But this time it's glass and steel, not stone and brick. Traffic hums below you. Neon glows above. Cameras blink silently from corners. Everything feels advanced, efficient, rational. And yet, under all that shine, you feel something old, ancient, even. Because you've entered the modern age, the age of modern war, ancient brains, it's easy to think you've evolved past the primal instincts. That skyscrapers and smartphones prove we've moved on. But your brain, it didn't get the memo. That gray, squishy mass between your ears is still wired for tribalism, territorial defense, and split-second decisions about threats. It still processes someone who looks, talks, or acts differently as a possible danger, unless you've worked hard to override that impulse. And here's the dangerous part. When you give ancient instincts modern tools, you don't get peace. You get precision warfare. The 20th century saw two world wars that dwarfed anything in human history, not just in numbers, but in reach, in complexity, in ideology. You didn't just kill someone because they lived on the wrong riverbank. You killed them because they represented something, an idea, a flag, a godless or God-fearing way of life. And for the first time, propaganda made it easy. Mass media meant you could demonize millions with a few posters, a radio broadcast, a film reel. Your enemy was no longer a specific person, it was an entire people. A blurry silhouette into which you could pour every fear, every grudge. And once that silhouette hardened, you could fire without guilt. Historians still argue about what made World War II so uniquely horrifying. Was it the global scale, the industrial reach, the ideologies? Probably all of the above. But what made it unforgettable was how normal people, clerks, teachers, factory workers, became part of the machine. They filled out forms, processed deportations, built bombs, not out of bloodlust, but obedience. The beauty of violence had arrived. And after the bombs fell, after the treaties were signed, came the Cold War, a conflict that didn't roar, but hummed. Nuclear arsenals, proxy wars, fear as policy. You weren't stabbing anyone, but you were living with the knowledge that someone somewhere could press a button and end the world in 12 minutes. It did something to your species, fractured it in subtle ways. Anxiety became background noise, trust frayed. Nations formed alliances not out of love, but mutual suspicion. You might find this quirky. The doomsday clock, created in 1947 by atomic scientists, ticks closer to midnight, not when a war breaks out, but when trust collapses. It's a symbol, yes, but also a mirror. And lately it's been ticking faster. Modern warfare doesn't look like the past. It's cleaner, faster, invisible even. Drone strikes launched from thousands of miles away. Cyber attacks disabling power grids. Economic sanctions that quietly starve a population. Violence by proxy. Violence by click. And here's the unsettling part. You don't see the victims. You see screens, numbers, after-action reports, maybe a blurry satellite image. You're 2 or 3 steps removed from the suffering. And that distance, it changes things because your ancient brain needs sight to feel compassion. A crying face, a bleeding wound, a voice. When those are gone, empathy struggles to keep up. That's why footage changes minds. Not facts, faces. And yet even in this cold modern warfare, the ancient instincts remain. Tribalism, revenge, honor. You still draw lines between us and them. Still defend your group, your belief, your imagined past. Politicians know this. Advertisers know this. Algorithms know this. And all of them feed it. Social media has become its own battleground. Language as weapon, outrage as currency, every like a banner, every retweet a spear. It's not just disagreement anymore. It's war in miniature. And you're tired. All of it feels too much. You lie there, phone on your chest, scrolling through bad news and worse replies. And somewhere deep in your old lizard-coded brain, something curls up, defensive, numb, suspicious. You want to turn it off, but you can't look away. Because this is the paradox. Even though you're safer than any human in history, more protected, more connected, you feel more under siege than ever. Historians still puzzle over this. Why do violence rates drop, but fear rises? Why do wars kill fewer people yet dominate our consciousness? Maybe because your brain was shaped for threats you could see. Not nuclear codes, not data leaks, not ideology. You're carrying Stone Age wiring into a Space Age world. And it's exhausting, so you retreat. You build smaller groups, seek certainty, gravitate toward people who think like you. And before you know it, the old tribal lines are back, painted in pixels, but just as sharp. But here's a gentle truth. Awareness is your only shield. If you know your instincts, you can pause, breathe, choose. The tools have changed. The world has changed. But you still get to decide what story you tell with them. And maybe, just maybe, you can write a different ending. It's quiet now. not the quiet of peace, but the heavy hush after too much noise. After centuries of screaming swords, thunderous guns and righteous shouting, the world seems to have softened. Fewer executions, fewer public hangings, less blood in the street, and yet, you're not celebrating. You're confused. Because despite all the stats, all the graphs, all the scholarly optimism, something still feels off. Why, if we're becoming less violent, do you still feel so on edge? Welcome to less stabbing, more shouting. The strange story of how you became physically safer and psychologically exhausted. Let's start with the numbers. Since the Stone Age, the rate of violent death has steadily declined. In prehistoric societies, you had as much as a 15% chance of dying at the hands of another human. Today, in most developed countries, it's well under 0.01%. Statistically, you're incredibly safe. But tell that to your nervous system. Historians, psychologists, and armchair philosophers still argue about what caused this decline. Some point to the rise of states, governments with a monopoly on violence. Others credit literacy, trade, education. Some cites the spread of empathy through novels, newspapers, and now videos like this one. Maybe it's all of those. Or maybe it's something stranger. Maybe we've begun to domesticate ourselves. The theory goes like this. Just as humans bred wolves into dogs, smaller, gentler, more cooperative, we may have over thousands of years bred ourselves into less reactive, less aggressive beings. Studies show that over time, human skeletons have become more graceful, less robust, less prone to bone-cracking brawls. Our faces are softer, our tempers duller. Even your eyebrows are more peaceful now. Really? Quirky fact. One hypothesis says expressive eyebrows helped early humans communicate subtle emotions, reducing misunderstandings and lowering the odds of a punch to the face. Your mirror neurons thank you. But let's not get too romantic, because while the fists may have stopped flying, the shouting has only gotten louder. Modern conflict isn't often fought with weapons. It's fought with words, on stages, in tweets, at dinner tables. Tribalism hasn't gone away. It's just changed jerseys. Political divides, culture wars, comment sections that feel like gladiator pits. You're not killing each other, but you're not exactly hugging either. You live in a paradox. Safer than ever, yet more anxious. More connected, yet more divided. Less war, more worry. Why? Because your ancient brain evolved in small groups, trust circles, clear hierarchies. Now you're exposed to millions of strangers, opinions and crises every hour. Your threat detection system is on constant high alert. It doesn't know how to interpret that angry headline, that viral outrage, that flashing emergency banner. So, it does what it's always done. Assumes danger, even if there isn't any. It's called empathic saturation, the feeling of drowning in other people's pain. Once upon a time, you might witness one tragedy in your life. A flood, a raid, a death in the village. Now you can see 10 before breakfast. And your poor prehistoric hardware isn't designed for that. You become numb, jittery, detached. And while the world grows less violent in action, it becomes more violent in feeling. Historians still debate whether this is a temporary phase or a long-term trend. Are we heading toward greater harmony or just bottling up the violence for some future explosion? Either way, your role in it matters because every generation has a choice. Amplify the shouting or slow it down. Sharpen the sword or melt it. You get to decide whether the cycle continues or whether it finally bends into something better. And here's something no one tells you. Peace is weird. It's quiet, boring, uneventful. Doesn't make headlines. It doesn't trend. But it's happening all the time in classrooms, in shared meals, in gentle disagreements that end in laughter instead of fists. You just don't notice it because peace doesn't scream. Tonight, your world isn't perfect. Far from it. But it is in many measurable ways better. So you can lie here, blanket tucked under your chin, knowing that you're part of a strange species, one that claws and bites, but also writes lullabies and builds shelters for strangers. And while the shouting may never fully stop, the stabbing is fading. It's not utopia, but it's something. You wake up in a mirror, not a real one, but a slow realization that everything you've seen in this story is still here, just reshaped, redressed, rewired. The ape, the soldier, the scientist, the shouting man in the comment section. They're all you, because this is the part where we ask, are we taming ourselves? It's a strange question. Sounds like something out of a science fiction novel, but evolutionary biologists take it seriously. Self-domestication theory suggests that over thousands of years, humans have been selectively breeding ourselves, though not in labs or kennels. In society, through norms, through pressure, through the quiet power of don't be like that. You know what that power looks like. You've felt it. That moment someone gives you a look when you're too loud. Too angry, too much, social shame, peer pressure, call-outs, all tools used, consciously or not, to encourage certain behaviors and suppress others. Early human communities likely ostracized or even executed those who were too violent, too unpredictable. Over time, those individuals left fewer descendants. The calmer ones survived, and it shows. You're more cooperative than your ancestors. You're better at reading emotions. You flinch at cruelty unless you're very tired or very online. Even your facial structure hints at this evolution. Compared to Neanderthals, you have flatter faces, smaller teeth, more rounded skulls, less intimidating, less aggressive. But, and here's the catch, it's not a straight line. Because humans are also adaptable. And when circumstances shift, old behaviors return, put people under pressure, scarcity, chaos, propaganda, and the mask slips. The old instincts surge forward, tribes reform, enemies reappear. You've seen it in riots, in war zones, in echo chambers online. The shadows never disappear completely. Historians still debate whether self-domestication is a real measurable process or just a compelling narrative. After all, we've also developed smarter ways to hurt each other. Drones, data, digital warfare. It's hard to say if we're less violent or just better at hiding it. One quirky example, the fox domestication experiment in Russia. Scientists bred generations of foxes, selecting only the tamest for reproduction. Over time, their ears drooped, their fur patterns changed, they wagged their tails. But along with cuteness came anxiety. The foxes became friendly but also twitchier, more dependent, more fragile. Makes you wonder what we've traded for our gentleness. You lie there now, a product of millennia of quiet shaping. Not just through genes, but through stories, rules, routines. You don't carry a spear, but you carry expectations. You don't live in a cave, but your instincts still whisper at shadows. And yet there's hope in your softness. You cry at movies. You hold the door for strangers. You feel guilty when you raise your voice. None of those are signs of weakness. They're signs of rewiring. The old brain still lives in you, but it's learned new tricks. Compassion, restraint, reflection. You think before you act. Most of the time you regret, you repair. And maybe that's the biggest evolutionary leap of all. Not that we stopped hurting each other, but that we started wanting to stop. Modern life still tests that daily. You live in a world flooded with stimuli, anger, noise. The algorithms reward outrage. The news thrives on fear. But you also live in a world with therapy, with community, with breathing exercises, with people who teach you how to say, I'm sorry, and mean it. Your species hasn't solved violence, but it started asking better questions. Not how do we win, but how do we avoid the fight? Not how do we destroy our enemies, but why did we make them enemies in the first place? And that's not weakness, that's wisdom. Because even a slightly more patient, more thoughtful human is still an astonishing leap from where we began. Screaming in trees, throwing stones, burning strangers. You still have fire in you, but now you cook with it. You write poems about it. You sit beside it and talk to people you once might have feared. Isn't that wild? You're a domesticated ape with Wi-Fi. A tribal animal watching bedtime history videos to fall asleep. A species that once solved everything with rocks, now solving things with words. Not always, not perfectly, but more and more often. You're standing at a crossroads now. Or maybe it's more of a mirror. Behind you, millennia of broken bones, burnt villages, spilled ink, and shouted prayers. Before you, a road winding into uncertainty, lit only by flickers of memory and the quiet, trembling hope that maybe, just maybe, we've learned something. Because this is it. the final duel, peace or power. The two voices inside you, always there. One speaks in fire and instinct, the other in hush and hindsight, the violent ape and the dreaming poet. And they both want control. You've seen how violence has shaped your past. From tribal raids over mammoth bones to drone strikes executed by remote, humans have never stopped refining how they hurt each other. You've watched that slow-burning saga unfold like an old scar, fading but never quite gone. And yet, you've also seen the resistance. For every war there's been a peace movement. For every execution, a philosopher. For every empire, a whisper saying, "We can be better than this." Historians still argue whether the human story is one of progress or cycles, whether we're climbing a moral mountain or just pacing a bloodied wheel. But that debate misses the real question. Not what have we done, but what do we do now? Because the tools are still here. The same intelligence that gave you antibiotics also gave you atom bombs. The same thirst for justice built both courtrooms and guillotines. The same drive that pushed you to explore the stars also helped you conquer entire continents. And the ape inside you still very much awake, just better dressed. It shows up in the way you honk when someone cuts you off, the way you argue online, the way your heart races when you're insulted, even gently. That tiny heat behind your ribs that says fight, win. Don't let them take this from you. But there's another heat, slower, softer, the warmth of reconciliation, the quiet triumph of walking away, the surge of pride when you choose not to lash out, even when every cell in your body is screaming too. And that's the real duel. Not between armies, but within you. Because peace isn't a treaty or a speech, it's a choice. One you make 10 times a day, usually without noticing. When you listen instead of interrupt, when you wait before reacting, when you let go of the need to be right or first or loudest. And that's not weakness, that's power. The kind of power the violent ape never understood. The kind that doesn't need to dominate or destroy. The kind that says, "We've tried that way for a long time, let's try something else." Quirky historical twist. Some of the most powerful movements in human history were non-violent. Gandhi's Salt March, Martin Luther King's marches, the fall of the Berlin Wall. No gunfire, just crowds, songs, courage. Don't mistake silence for surrender. Sometimes silence is strategy. You're living in a time of contradiction. Violence is down, but anxiety is up. We're more tolerant, but more easily offended. We crave peace, but binge chaos. That's the friction of evolution in real time. And yet you're still trying. Every time you take a deep breath instead of shouting, every time you reach across the aisle, every time you soften your voice instead of sharpening your words, that's resistance. That's revolution. Not in parades, in patience, not in power grabs, in grace. So now, as the lights dim in your room and the world outside grows still, you lie at the edge of something ancient and unfinished. A story that began in fire and fear and might, just might end in understanding, but only if you choose it. Only if you listen not to the loudest voice in your head, but the wisest one, the one that whispers, "You don't have to be the violent ape anymore. You can be something else." And now you've reached the end. Let the weight of the story ease off your shoulders. Let the echoes fade into soft silence. You've wandered through millennia of pain and survival, through shadow and fire. And yet here you are, still breathing, still listening. You're not being hunted, not fighting a battle. There are no spears, no alarms, no marchers in the street. Just a quiet room, a safe bed. The sound of your own breath. In and out, in and out. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands relax. Let your thoughts slow like embers settling in a hearth. The past was violent, yes, but the future, it's soft clay, still wet, still shaping. And you, as small and sleepy as you may feel right now, are part of that shaping. You don't have to bear the weight of history on your shoulders. Just hold it softly. Keep it in mind when the moment comes again, because it always does. Violence isn't unavoidable. It's one thread in the fabric, but so is peace, so is kindness, so is rest. And right now, rest is all that matters. No more noise, no more conflict, only the comfort of knowing that you've made it through the hardest parts of the human story. And now you're free to drift, eyes growing heavier, thoughts becoming gentler, the last flickers of firelight fading from your mind. Let sleep carry you. Let stillness take over this time. The ape is silent.